On September 22nd, 1951, something very unusual happened in the mountains of Montana. A small airplane with two engines flew over a wild valley called the Meadow Creek Basin. The plane was carrying cargo, but not the normal kind. Inside the aircraft were 92 live beavers, each one sitting inside a wooden box. One by one, workers pushed these boxes out of the aeroplane door. Each box had a parachute attached to the top. The parachutes opened and the boxes floated down through the mountain air. When they hit the ground, the boxes popped open automatically and the beavers walked out into their new home. Out of 92 beavers, 90 landed safely. Only 2 beavers died, and that was because they chewed their way out of the box while still falling through the air. They dropped without a parachute. At the time, this seemed like a clever but small solution to a local problem. Nobody understood what would happen next. Those 90 beavers and their children and grandchildren would spend the next 75 years changing 1.5 million acres of American wilderness. Scientists today call this one of the biggest accidental nature experiments ever conducted in North America. This is the full story of how it happened. Why beavers matter more than you think. To understand why anyone would throw beavers out of an aeroplane, you first need to understand what beavers do and why they almost disappeared. Before European settlers came to North America, beavers lived everywhere. Scientists estimate there were between 50 million and 300 million beavers across the continent. These animals are nature's builders. They cut down trees with their teeth, drag the logs into streams, and stack them together with mud to make dams. A beaver dam blocks the flow of a stream. Water backs up behind the dam and forms a pond. Over time, a single beaver family can create a whole network of ponds connected by channels. These ponds change everything around them. The ponds store water like natural reservoirs. During rainy seasons, they hold extra water and prevent floods downstream. During dry seasons, they release water slowly, keeping streams flowing even when no rain falls. The wetlands around beaver ponds become homes for frogs, fish, birds, insects, and dozens of other species. For thousands of years, beavers shaped the landscape of North America. Rivers flowed slowly through chains of beaver ponds. Valleys stayed green and wet even in summer. The water table, which is the level of water underground, stayed high because the ponds soaked the soil like a sponge. Then everything changed. The Great Beaver Hunt. European fur traders arrived in North America in the 1700s. They discovered that beaver fur was incredibly valuable. The thick, waterproof underfur of a beaver could be pressed into a special kind of felt used to make hats. These beaver felt hats became wildly fashionable in Europe. Every wealthy man wanted one. The price of beaver pelts skyrocketed. A single beaver skin could sell for as much money as an equal weight of precious metal. Trappers called what followed a mammalian gold rush. For 200 years, hunters pushed across the continent, trapping every beaver they could find. Entire colonies and trading companies were built around the beaver trade. When the beavers in one region ran out, the trappers moved west to find more. The Northwest Company, one of the oldest companies in North American history, was founded specifically to trade beaver furs. By 1910, the slaughter was nearly complete. The beaver population had collapsed from hundreds of millions to roughly 150,000 animals. In many regions, beavers had disappeared entirely. People alive at that time had never seen a beaver dam. They did not know what the landscape was supposed to look like. What happens when the beavers disappear? The loss of beavers caused a disaster that unfolded slowly over decades. Without beaver dams holding water across the landscape, streams began to change. A stream without dams flows faster. Faster water cuts deeper into the ground. The stream carves a narrow channel and drops below the level of the surrounding land. When the water level drops, the floodplain dries out. The water table falls. Plants that need wet soil die. the sponge-like wetlands that stored water vanish. Across the American West, rivers that had once wandered through networks of ponds became narrow, eroded ditches. Flash floods became more common because there were no beaver ponds to slow the water down. Droughts became more severe because there were no beaver ponds to store water and release it slowly. Scientists today call this process stream incision. It is still happening in places where beavers have not returned. The damage from 200 years of beaver hunting is still visible in the shape of rivers across North America. The government decides to fix it. By the 1940s, government officials finally understood the problem. Beavers were not just cute animals, they were ecosystem engineers. They built infrastructure that cost nothing to maintain and benefited everyone. The federal government began a program to relocate beavers back into their historic range. The math was simple and compelling. Catching and moving one beaver cost about $12. The value of the work that one beaver would do over its lifetime was estimated at $450. That is a return of roughly 37 times the original investment, all produced by an animal that works for free. Conservation officers began trapping beavers in areas where they were causing problems and moving them to remote wilderness areas where they were needed. The program seemed to be working. Then World War II ended and a new problem emerged. The post-war boom creates a crisis. When the war ended in 1945, millions of American soldiers came home. They wanted houses, jobs, and families. In Montana, veterans and their families flooded into the rural valleys around Helena and Seeley Lake. New roads, new homes, and new farms spread across the countryside. This development collided directly with beaver populations that had been recovering for more than a decade. Suddenly, beavers were everywhere that people wanted to be. Homeowners woke up to find their ornamental trees cut down overnight. Farmers found their irrigation canals blocked. Roads flooded when beaver dams backed up streams. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks received more complaint calls every week. People wanted the beavers gone. The traditional solution was to trap the problem beavers and move them to remote backcountry areas. But this method was failing badly. The problem with horses. Moving beavers by horse or mule sounds simple, but it was killing the animals. A beaver is built for water. Its body is designed to stay cool by swimming in ponds and streams. Take that beaver out of the water, strap it to a sweating horse, and carry it through hot mountain forests for 6 hours, and the beaver overheats. Many beavers died during these long trips. The ones that survived often arrived weak, stressed, and sick. They refused to eat. They wandered away from the release site instead of settling down. The mortality rate was unacceptably high. Conservation officers needed a new method, something faster that would get the beavers to their new homes before they could overheat or panic. One man figured out the answer. Albert E. Vance's big idea. His name was Albert E. Vance, and he was a conservation officer for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Vance had noticed two important facts. First, the Meadow Creek Basin, one of the best places in Montana to release beavers, was accessible by small aircraft. Planes could fly over the valley in less than an hour. Second, the United States military had left behind enormous piles of surplus equipment after World War II. Warehouses were full of unused parachutes that the government was practically giving away. Vance connected these two facts in a way nobody else had considered. What if you loaded beavers into crates, flew them over the wilderness, and dropped them with parachutes? The trip would take minutes instead of hours. The beavers would never have time to overheat. It sounded crazy. It also sounded cheap. And Vance believed he could make it work. Building the perfect beaver box. The biggest challenge was designing a crate that would protect the beaver during the fall, survive the landing, and open automatically so the beaver could walk out. Vance spent weeks testing different designs at the Missoula airfield. He dropped empty boxes from aeroplanes to see how they landed. He dropped weighted boxes to simulate the weight of a beaver inside. He measured the force of impact and studied which parts of the crate broke. Early designs failed in predictable ways. Some crates did not open on landing, trapping the beaver inside with no one around to help. Other crates opened during the fall, dumping the beaver out while it was still in the air. One creative design used willow twig baskets. The idea was that the beaver would chew through the willow, weakening the basket until it fell apart after landing. In testing, the beavers just sat there, confused. They did not chew on cue. Vance kept trying. His final design was elegant in its simplicity. He built 2 wooden boxes, each measuring 32 inches long, 14 inches wide, and 10 inches tall. The boxes had breathing holes drilled in the sides. He hinged the 2 boxes together and connected them with thick elastic bands stretched across the bottom. When the crate was loaded, ropes held the 2 halves closed. The beaver sat inside in darkness, calm and secure. When the crate hit the ground, the force of impact snapped the ropes. The elastic bands acted like springs, forcing the 2 halves apart. The crate popped open automatically, and the beaver could simply walk away. It works perfectly in testing, but before he could drop 92 beavers, Vance needed to prove the system was safe for live animals. Meet Barnaby. Every good story needs a hero, and this one has a beaver named Barnaby. Barnaby was an older male beaver, selected to be the test subject for the entire operation. Vance loaded him into a prototype crate, took him up in a small plane over Montana, and pushed the crate out at about 600 feet above the ground. The parachute opened. The crate drifted down. It hit the ground. The springs worked. The box popped open, and Barnaby walked out, completely unharmed. Then Vance did something remarkable. He put Barnaby back in the crate and did it again. Over the testing phase, Barnaby was dropped from aeroplanes multiple times, from different heights, to confirm the system worked consistently. According to Vance's published paper in the Conservation Science Quarterly, Barnaby became so accustomed to the process that he would voluntarily crawl back into the crate for the next flight. That is not an exaggeration or a legend. It is recorded in the official scientific literature. When the full operation was finally approved, Barnaby earned a place of honor on the first official flight. His reward for serving as the test subject was a one-way ticket to the Meadow Creek Basin with 2 young female beavers chosen to accompany him into retirement. Over several days in September 1951, the operation unfolded according to plan. Workers trapped beavers near the towns where they were causing problems. They loaded them into the specially designed crates, usually 2 beavers per crate. They drove the crates to the Missoula airfield and loaded them onto a twin-engine Douglas C-47 aeroplane. The plane flew over the Meadow Creek Basin at altitudes between 600 and 900 feet. Conservation officers had selected drop sites carefully, choosing meadows with good water sources, plenty of trees for building dams, and enough distance from existing beaver colonies to avoid territorial conflicts. Each crate was pushed out the aeroplane door with a surplus military parachute strapped to the top. The parachute opened, the crate floated down, and on impact, the box popped open. The team tried to balance each group with 1 male and several females, because research showed that small family groups with more females had the highest survival rates. In total, 92 beavers made the trip. 90 landed alive and healthy. The 2 beavers that died were unusually strong and determined. They chewed their way out of the crate during the fall and dropped straight to the ground without a parachute. There was nothing anyone could do. The total cost of the operation ran between $12 and $20 per beaver, which would be roughly $220 to $440 in today's money. That included airplane fuel, surplus parachutes, crate construction materials, and the time of the workers involved. The beavers get to work. Vance sent teams back to the Meadow Creek Basin in 1952 to check on the beavers. What they found surprised even him. The animals had not scattered across the wilderness. They had not been killed by predators in unusual numbers. They had not wandered aimlessly, confused by their strange arrival. Within months of landing in a valley none of them had ever seen before, the beavers had started building. Dams were going up across the streams, ponds were forming. Lodges, the dome-shaped houses beavers build in the middle of their ponds, were under construction. This is because dam building is not a learned behavior for beavers. It is instinct. Scientists call it innate behavior. Beavers are born knowing how to build dams. The sound of running water and the presence of trees triggers the behavior automatically. Drop an adult beaver into suitable habitat and within days it will start work. It finds a narrow spot in a stream, begins cutting down saplings with its teeth and starts stacking them across the water. It packs mud into the gaps to seal the dam. Water backs up behind the structure and forms a pond. The 1951 beavers did not need instructions. They did not need time to adjust. Their brains were already programmed with everything they needed to know. The wilderness that protected them. Here is where the story takes its most important turn. In 1978, 27 years after the beaver drop, President Jimmy Carter signed a law designating 1.5 million acres of central Montana, including the entire Meadow Creek Basin, as the Bob Marshall Wilderness. This is one of the strictest forms of land protection that exists in the United States. Within this wilderness, there are no roads. No motorized vehicles of any kind are allowed. No permanent buildings can be built. No logging, no mining, and no development of any type is permitted. The wilderness is named after Bob Marshall, a conservationist who spent decades fighting to protect this backcountry. When Marshall and the other lawmakers drew the boundaries, they were thinking about preserving wild rivers and mountain scenery. They were not thinking about beavers at all. To them, the beavers were just part of the background, invisible animals going about their business. But the legal protection that was secured turned out to be the most important factor in what happened next. The accidental experiment. Scientists who study ecosystem restoration face a constant problem. In almost every place where beavers have been reintroduced, humans are still present and active. People build roads through beaver habitat. They complain when beaver dams flood property. They trap beavers that cause problems. They remove dams that interfere with infrastructure. This means that no modern beaver restoration project operates in truly natural conditions. Humans are always there, managing, interfering, and limiting what the beavers can do. The Bob Marshall Wilderness is different. For 75 years, the descendants of those 90 parachuted beavers have lived and built and expanded with essentially zero human interference. Nobody removes their dams. Nobody traps them. Nobody builds roads through the wetlands they create. Nobody manages or monitors them in any meaningful way. This has turned the Meadow Creek Basin into something scientists have never been able to create on purpose. A control experiment showing what happens when you let beavers do whatever they want for multiple generations. How beavers reshape a landscape. The process is slow but relentless. A beaver family builds a dam. Water backs up and forms a pond. The pond traps sediment, which is the mud and sand that normally washes downstream. Over years, the sediment builds up behind the dam. The stream bed rises. Water spreads out across the floodplain. As the ground becomes wetter, certain types of plants begin to grow. Willows, alders, and aspens thrive in wet soil. These are also the exact species that beavers prefer to eat and build with. More food and building material means the beaver colony can grow larger. A larger colony builds more dams. More dams create more ponds. What starts as a single dam becomes, over decades, a chain of connected wetlands stretching for miles along a valley floor. The water table rises across the entire area. Springs that had dried up begin flowing again. The landscape transforms. NASA satellites have photographed the Bob Marshall Wilderness from space. The images show wetland expansion across the basin, which is exactly the pattern you would expect from decades of beaver engineering. The benefits nobody expected. When Albert E. Vance dropped those beavers in 1951, he was solving a practical problem: how to relocate nuisance animals cheaply and safely. He could not have predicted the benefits that would unfold over the following decades. Water storage. Beaver ponds act like natural reservoirs. They hold water during wet seasons and release it slowly during dry periods. In a region where water is precious, this is incredibly valuable. Flood control. When heavy rains fall, beaver ponds absorb the surge. Water spreads across the floodplain instead of rushing downstream in a destructive wave. Drought resilience. During dry years, streams fed by beaver ponds keep flowing longer than streams without them. The ponds maintain flow even when no rain has fallen for weeks. Habitat for fish. Central Montana is home to trout and salmon that migrate more than 700 miles to the ocean and return years later to spawn in the mountain streams where they were born. Beaver ponds provide critical habitat for young fish. The deep, slow water gives juvenile fish a place to grow before making the dangerous journey downstream. The ponds also stay cooler than open streams during summer heat waves, providing refuge when the rest of the stream becomes dangerously warm. Habitat for other wildlife. Frogs and salamanders breed in beaver ponds. Ducks and other waterfowl nest in the wetlands. Songbirds flock to the willows that grow along the water's edge. Deer, elk, and moose drink from the ponds and feed on the vegetation. Entire food webs depend on the ecosystem that beavers create. The fire effect. In 2024, as the American West faces increasingly severe droughts and catastrophic wildfire seasons, one benefit of beaver engineering has become impossible to ignore. Beaver wetlands act as fire breaks. When a wildfire sweeps across a dry landscape, it burns everything in its path. But when the fire reaches a beaver wetland, something different happens. The ground is wet. The vegetation is green and full of moisture. The fire slows down, weakens, and sometimes stops entirely. Satellite images from recent megafires have shown this effect clearly. In the middle of vast burned areas, there are patches of green survival. These are beaver wetlands, where the fire could not spread. Wildlife sheltered in these refuges while everything around them burned. A 2024 research study from Oregon State University confirms that beaver-engineered landscapes provide meaningful protection against fire and drought. In a warming climate, this protection is becoming more and more valuable. A beaver pond does not just hold water, it holds life. The story almost lost. Albert E. Vance published his results in the Conservation Science Quarterly in 1953. The paper described his methods, his crate design, and his success rates. It was a useful contribution to conservation science, but it did not receive widespread attention. Vance died decades before anyone understood the full significance of what he had done. He never saw the wetlands that his 90 beavers would create. He never knew that climate scientists would one day cite beaver-engineered landscapes as models for water management across the entire American West. The original film footage from the 1951 operation was misclassified and buried in the Montana State Archives. It sat forgotten for 65 years until a fish and game historian named Linda Morris rediscovered it in 2018. She found the canisters in a back room, incorrectly labelled and gathering dust. When the footage was restored and released, the internet went wild. People could not believe that in 1951, government workers had actually thrown beavers out of aeroplanes with parachutes. It seemed like a joke or a tall tale, but it was real, documented in official records and film. Still building, after 75 years. As of today, the descendants of those 90 beavers are still at work in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. They have never stopped. For 75 years, generation after generation of beavers has built dams, created ponds, expanded wetlands, and reshaped the landscape of central Montana. Their population has grown and spread across the basin. The wetland complex they have engineered now covers areas that were dry meadows when the parachutes came down. They will keep building for as long as the water runs, and nobody stops them. The Bob Marshall Wilderness remains protected. No roads will be built through it. No developers will drain the wetlands. No trappers will hunt the beavers. The experiment that began in 1951 will continue indefinitely, watched over by laws that had nothing to do with beavers, but protect them anyway. What this story teaches us. This is a story about unintended consequences, the good kind for once. Albert E. Vance was trying to solve a small problem efficiently. He succeeded. But he also set in motion something much larger, an ecosystem restoration project that nobody planned and nobody managed, running for almost 8 decades. The results suggest something important about conservation. Sometimes the best thing humans can do is get out of the way. Give animals the space and protection they need and let nature work. The beavers already know what to do. Their instincts are millions of years old. They do not need instructions, management, or supervision. They just need suitable habitat and freedom from interference. 90 beavers, surplus parachutes, a test beaver named Barnaby who learned to love being dropped out of aeroplanes, a valley that would become federal wilderness 27 years later, and 75 years of compound ecological interest still paying out today. That is the full story of how Montana threw beavers out of aeroplanes and accidentally helped restore one of the last great wild landscapes in the United States.